Recording in progress. Okay. Welcome, folks. Abram Dickerson here from Aspire Adventure Running. Really excited to be here with our coach, Andrew Fast, and with Shannon O'Grady from Gnarly Nutrition. As folks are showing up, would love it if you just want to drop your name and where you're from in the chat. We'll give folks a minute to arrive. Welcome. This is always kind of the fun part, right? Like, where are people coming from? And then me trying to figure out where the chat is. Okay, there it is.
I know. Oh, it is cool to see where people are from all over.
Yeah. Cool. It's Bree. Hey, Bree, good to see you or not see you.
Bellingham, such a nice place to live.
I just had an athlete head up to a wedding in Bellingham, and it was so fun to give some trail data and know how awesome it probably is right now, and be a little bit bitter that I'm not there. But yeah, they ended up, they just went crazy in the Chuckanuts and did a little mountain biking Galbraith. And
there.
Well, we're definitely
Athens, Georgia. Good music comes through there.
We're in the pocket right now where we're coming out of the long, dark, gray, cold into like, oh, hey, moderate temps and sunshine, and we'll get clouds and gray, but like the sun will come out and it's pretty fantastic. So that's nice.
It's a little bit unseasonably warm, I feel, in Salt Lake. Could be, I don't know. It was like 75 the last 2 days.
75, wow.
Yeah, no lack of, the snow's melting quick, no lack of sunshine though. It's like in the Northwest in the spring, the sun comes out and it's like, I always felt like a possum kind of crawling out of a hole, It's like,
yeah, here's this tricky thing because the mountains are there, but we're on the coast, so it's like it feels like spring, and so your brain kind of makes this like flip, but it's still winter in the mountains, and there's still so much great skiing and other things happening, but it's like psychologically, it's just kind of this weird seasonal duality that's happening. So.
Yeah, as soon as trails are dry, it's hard to convince myself to go up to hit the snow.
It's still there, right?
Recreation, it's hard.
Yeah.
The shoulder seasons are my favorite.
Great. Well, looks like, where are we at? We're at 6:03. I'll go ahead and start with some introductions and give folks an outline for the night. So fundamentally, the spring training community is an opportunity to answer kind of one driving question that I get asked a lot at Aspire, which is like, well, how, can I be prepared, or what do I have to do to prepare? Or, I want to do these multi-day stage runs, or you're a person, or I'm a person that wants to do mountain running, and like, what are the steps to being prepared physically, mentally, and all the ways to go out and have these big days in the mountains. And as really someone who's been a non-professional athlete and just kind of been curious and trail curious my entire life, I found it's just an aggregation of literature and talking to professionals and gathering these resources. And so our goal with the spring training community is to do just that, to create a template, which we have from Andrew, which is our 3-month training program. So that's an outline and a resource for folks that are putting in the time and putting in the work to be ready for some big summer adventures. And then pairing that with information to supplement that training process. So today, really excited to have Shannon O'Grady, who's coming at us. She was the chief product developer at Gnarly Nutrition. But she brings a super strong science background with a PhD in biology and emphasis on sports nutrition physiology. And so we're going to hear from her first off, and that will kind of provide some insights into the fueling strategies for training and recovery and performance. And then we'll provide some space for some questions for her, from you all for her, and then we'll turn some time over to Andrew. He can this will be kind of our check-in with him as the coach in terms of where you are at in your training, any questions you have, and then what's kind of coming down the pipe over the next month training block. Sound good? Since I'm only here, I'm seeing 2 heads nod, so we're going to go with it. Thanks everyone for being here. Shannon, the stage is yours. I will figure out where that button is to make you the host.
Be the host.
Ah, man, I gotta probably hide the chat and then go here more. And you are now the host.
Okay, awesome. Now I've got to share my screen. Should be this one. I'm gonna go to. All right. Can Abram or Andrew, you can see it? Okay, great. Thanks everyone for joining on. Thanks for the introduction, Abram. I'm super excited to be here. One of my favorite things, I do a lot of things for Gnarly, but working with athletes to fine tune their nutrition is probably the thing I enjoy most. So today I'm going to be talking about fueling essentials with specifics for training and endurance. Just to take you through, let me move Andrew and Abram's faces so I can see my slides, just to take you through kind of an outline of what I'm going to talk about. I always like to start with some science. I feel like, I promise I'll keep it kind of on the lower end, but I feel like people are more apt to actually use suggestions if they kind of understand where they're coming from. So I like to give you the scientific background behind what I'm suggesting. So I'm going to start by talking about energy systems and fuel use. Then I'm going to talk about pre-run nutrition, during run nutrition, and post-run nutrition. Okay, so energy systems and fuel use. This is my favorite running quote. Not just running quote, endurance quote of all time. You could replace running with endurance sports, and it's pretty much an eating contest on the go, meaning that all things being equal as far as training, the person that can get in the most calories and kind of keep their digestive system happy is going to really be able to capitalize on all the training they've done and perform better on race day. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. So this is the science. I wanted to start by talking about the major energy currency of the body, which is ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. So that's this really crude diagram, this brown blob with these 3 yellow circles. You can think of it as a charged battery. In these phosphate bonds attached to this adenosine molecule, of which there are 3, that's why it's triphosphate, there's a lot of energy stored. So when you break off one of these phosphates, you get this release of energy, and that's why this is such a powerful molecule. And this is a circular system, so much as if you break off a phosphate, you can also add one back in. So the main energy systems that our body uses to generate ATP are the creatine phosphate system, sometimes referred to as the phosphagen system, the anaerobic metabolism or glycolysis, which uses carbohydrates to generate ATP, and then aerobic glycolysis, which uses carbohydrates or fats. So a lot of people think about these energy systems as kind of like, oh, one turns off and the other one turns on, but really kind of at mid intensity, they're all working to some degree. And that's why I really like the graph I have in this slide here. So on the x-axis, we have exercise intensity from a low intensity to a really high intensity with ATP needs on the y-axis. So we see really high ATP needs when we're at a high intensity and lower ATP needs when we're at a lower intensity. Aerobic metabolism or glycolysis is in green, and then anaerobic glycolysis is in yellow, and creatine phosphate is in orange. And what I want you to pay attention to is that at these lower intensities, we see kind of more of a green color, where aerobic metabolism is the thing that is the dominant energy system used. And as we kind of increase in intensity, we see anaerobic glycolysis kicking on, and then the creatine phosphate system becoming important at really high intensities. So running is primarily an aerobic activity. This is specific in this talk to more endurance running. And at very low intensities, we see fat served as the primary fuel, but carbs become important as intensity increases. And this is because at low intensities, we're able to get a lot of our energy aerobically. We can take in enough oxygen to satisfy those energetic needs. But once we hit our anaerobic threshold, which is really defined by this, limit to which we can bring in oxygen and satisfy those needs, that's when anaerobic metabolism kicks in, because we're not able to satisfy all those needs through the oxygen we breathe in. And so anaerobic, or the absence of metabolism that occurs in the absence of oxygen, kicks on to help. And because we can't burn fat anaerobically, that's why carbohydrates become really important. So fat is a predominant fuel at lower intensities, and then we see the importance of carbs increase as we increase in intensity. And this is a really, topic that's gotten a lot of heat lately, as you see people doing the keto diet, as you see fat adaptation becoming something that more people are interested in. They want to know kind of where this fat carbohydrate mix, to what degree, you use one or the other, occurs at this end of the spectrum. And the proportion that you use fat versus carbs depends upon a number of things. It's not really going to be the focus of my talk today, but it can depend upon the amount of fat you have in your diet, the amount of carbohydrates you have in a diet, and also the type of training. So if you've ever done long, slow distance or LSD training, where you're really running for long periods of time at a really low effort level, kind of, more in, the perceived effort range of like below 5, that is where your body's using fat. And you do that because you're training your body to use fat, and you're building up cardiovascular efficiency. So that's the whole idea behind fat adaptation, and you can do that through training and through diet. But what I want to talk about today is a misconception that a lot of people have, that like taking in fat as a fuel is a good thing for endurance exercise, and why taking in carbohydrates is really what you need to focus on. So first, let's talk about energy stores in humans. So this table kind of shows the amount of carbohydrates and fat stores we have in our bodies. So carbohydrates, you have carbohydrates as blood glucose, and then you have carbohydrate stores in the form of glycogen in both your liver and your muscle. And collectively, liver and muscle glycogen, it's about 1,900 to 2,000 calories, which is around enough to fuel 60 to 90 minutes of running. And that's assuming that your carbohydrate stores are full. Whereas if we look at fat, we have free fatty acids and triglycerides in our blood. But then if we look at muscle triglycerides alone, which is fat you store in your muscles, we have more muscle triglyceride stores than we do glycogen stored in our liver and our muscle. And research has shown that endurance athletes actually store more triglycerides or fat in their muscles than the average person. So there's an interesting adaptation there for the use of fat as a fuel in muscles. And then of course, depending on your adipose stores, it's almost infinite in the amount of fat you have stored. But what I hear a lot is people kind of mistake this idea of fat adaptation is using fat as a fuel that you take in. And so the graph I showed you, that was a lean, a general assumption of a lean athlete. So most athletes have plenty of fat on board for really long endurance events. So Gnarly has an athlete, Mike McKnight, who, not as a performance goal, but more almost as a science experiment, has done these fasted 100-mile runs to see if he could fuel, within his fat burning zone, a run of that distance. And he succeeded in running 100 miles in 18 hours on 0 calories, which is insane. But it proves the point that in terms of fat that we have stored in our bodies, if we are operating in the zone where our body likes to burn fat, there is enough supply there. Fat is also slower to digest than carbohydrates. And so bringing it in as kind of an outside fuel is not ideal because it takes longer to digest. It also requires more oxygen to make the ATP that we end up using. And as a reminder, we can't use it anaerobically. So if we have to dip into that higher intensity, it's not a great fuel for that. So it shouldn't be your primary fuel, but some can be helpful. And if you're operating at a lower intensity, if you're doing more of an endurance hike, because fat has almost double the calories or double the calories of carbohydrates, if you are operating at a low intensity, then it's an ideal way to carry more calories per weight. So, I spent a fair amount of time talking about why you shouldn't use fat. Now I'm going to try to convince you that carbohydrates are your friend. So glycogen is our body's storage form of carbohydrates. As I showed you in that table, our body stores enough glycogen to fuel about 60 to 90 minutes of exercise, depending on how much carbohydrate you have in your diet. We store our glycogen in our liver, which is primarily responsible for maintaining our blood glucose, but then also in our muscles, which is what actually supplies energy when our muscles do work or contract. Carbohydrates are great because they can be used both aerobically and anaerobically, but there is a limit to the amount that we can bring in. So once our glycogen stores have gotten low, we bring in carbohydrates to keep us going during exercise, but physiologically can't really absorb more than about 400 kilocalories per hour, or about 100 grams per hour. And so to take in high levels of carbohydrates, which I would define as 90 grams or more, most people need to train their guts or get used to taking in that much carbohydrate during exercise. So glycemic index is a great way to kind of distinguish between different types of carbohydrates. And this graph is kind of defining the difference between high glycemic index and low glycemic index foods. So on the x-axis, we have time, and on the y-axis, we have blood glucose. And glycemic index is essentially how quickly a given carbohydrate is going to increase your blood glucose, and then to what degree. So high glycemic index foods raise your blood glucose quickly, or to a high degree pretty quickly, whereas low glycemic index foods raise it to a much lower extent, and it's more of a gradual increase. And so most people would look at these foods in red and be like, oh, those aren't very good for you. And the green foods, yeah, those are what are quote unquote healthy. But the thing is, beyond just like having cookies on a regular basis, being good for life, a lot of these high glycemic index foods, the ones that are lower in fat and higher in carbohydrate, are really great for elevating our blood sugar quickly. And they should be timed around effort. So before and during exercise, having high glycemic index foods can keep our blood glucose elevated. And then after exercise, once our glycogen stores are depleted, they can quickly replenish those glycogen stores. And this is particularly important for multi-day events, or if you're doing like back-to-back long runs during training. Low glycemic index foods or complex carbs are really important throughout the day. And it's, because they're high in micronutrients like vitamins and minerals and fiber, but also because these are the things that kind of keep our glycogen storage high. So prepare us for, those longer runs. So before and during exercise, this is kind of what we're going to start by talking about. So I want to quickly talk about that threshold, or the limit to carbohydrate assimilation that I mentioned earlier, of about 400 kilocalories. So I've purposely blacked out part of this graph so I can kind of reveal it to make a point. So on the x-axis, we have carbohydrate intake during exercise in grams per hour. And on the y-axis, we have a lot of big words: exogenous carbohydrate oxidation, which basically means like the carbohydrates that you're eating, how your body uses them as energy. So right now that I just have one line and I'm showing you single carbohydrate source. So this is just like one type of sugar. Maybe it's glucose or fructose, right? Just one type of sugar that you're taking in. And at about 60 grams per hour, we see a max of the amount of sugar that you're actually able to use, or your body's able to use as energy. And if you take in more, you don't get any increased benefit. You just kind of increase the likelihood that you're going to end up, needing to go to the bathroom during your race or run to the porta potty. So gastrointestinal problems are going to occur. And this is because we get the saturation of the transport protein that pushes this carbohydrate into our bloodstream. So this is where this idea of multiple transportable carbohydrates came up. And the whole kind of concept is that, like, well, if we might saturate one transport protein, why not use two? Because different carbohydrates use different transport proteins. And then if we're using two, we can get a total increase in the amount of carbohydrates we're able to absorb. And so you're using a combination of carbohydrates that are transported into the circulation via different transporters. And it allows a higher level of carbohydrate use when compared to just one carbohydrate type. So specifically, using glucose, which uses one transporter, and fructose, which uses a totally different transporter, allows you to take in more total carbohydrate. So I've now revealed the grand reveal, this other part of this graph. And you can see that when you use multiple transportable carbohydrates, which is the line in blue, we exceed the 60-gram maximum that that research has shown with a single carbohydrate source. We can get up to 90 grams, and this is kind of the sweet spot, right? Between 60 and 90 grams, where it's unlikely that we'll have gastrointestinal problems. Some athletes, if they can really train their gut or have a iron stomach, can potentially get in even higher than that, but it really takes a lot of work. And so this is the idea behind Gnarly's endurance nutrition product. We have two different forms of sugars, dextrose, which is also another name for glucose, and sucrose, which is a combination of fructose and glucose. And it allows you to take in a higher amount of carbohydrates by using two forms of sugar. So Fuel 2.0 has 25 grams of sugar per 12 ounces. And obviously for longer events, we recommend 2 to 2.5 servings per hour. And then I always recommend additional calories from food. So liquid nutrition is great, but getting in some solid nutrition, I think, is good for your stomach all around. And then you're getting all different types of carbohydrates in your body. So what I'm trying to convince you of is that carbs should really be your fuel focus, but it's important to note that carbohydrate needs should change with training, both in and out of the actual workout. So in this table, we have daily carbohydrate needs from light to very high. So if you're doing pretty light training, 3 to 5 grams per kilo of body weight per day is recommended. As you increase that, moderate training is defined as an hour per day. That's 5 to 7 grams of carbs per kilo of body weight. And then when you get into high to very high training, so 1 to 3 hours per day on your, if you're doing a really heavy training week and you're running over 4 hours per day, or getting frequent runs of that duration within a week, then you're getting up to the 6 to maybe 8 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per day. So pay attention through your training when you have off weeks, or you come off of a heavy training week. Yeah, maybe then you bring the carbohydrates down a bit, but make sure you're getting enough carbs to really fuel your efforts during those harder or longer distance weeks. Oops. So, okay, there we go. This also extends to your carbohydrate needs during training. So this table from the study in clinical sports medicine says, anything under 45 minutes, I would extend that almost to 60 to 90 minutes, depending on your carbohydrate stores. You might not need any fuel. Small amounts or a carbohydrate mouth rinse, which can encourage your body to process carbohydrates, can be helpful on kind of the longer end of that range. But then once you get to runs of 2 hours or longer, then you're looking to get on a specific intake regimen, so 30 to 60 grams per hour, and then for longer events, working up to 90 grams per hour, with a reminder that if you're not currently doing this, it would be something I would work up to. So first thing is to pay attention and actually track how many carbohydrates you're taking in on a regular basis if you're not already, and then make small gradual increases from that amount and see how you feel. It's going to take a little bit to get your gut used to taking in that much carbohydrate. And as soon as you start having GI issues, then maybe cut it off and stay at a level below that for a while till you find kind of your own sweet spot. So kind of as a summary of this part, during longer efforts, your body's going to be using a combination of fat and carbs. So fat that you have on board and carbohydrates that you're taking in as fuel. So the lower your cardiovascular output is, or the lower your effort is, the larger contribution body fat's going to make to that, and the fewer carbs you may need to take in. But it's important to get a baseline of how many carbohydrates you're taking in, see what's working for you, and maybe slowly start to work that up. Okay, so now let's get into pre-run nutrition. So what should you eat before you race and run? So I like to kind of start by talking about this earlier. I call it the pre-run nutrition meal, which is about 2 to 3 hours before start time. The goal of this meal is to restock glycogen, especially after an overnight fast. So a lot of people doing races or big efforts, maybe that they've organized themselves, are going to have a pretty early start time. And so you really have fasted overnight, and your carbohydrate, particularly your liver glycogen stores, are much lower. And so getting something in ahead of time to restock that glycogen can be helpful. So this meal is going to be mostly carbohydrates, maybe a little bit of protein, 8 to 10 grams. The carbohydrate goal should be around 75 to 100 grams, which is 300 to 400 calories. So the longer the race, the more calories. Also, the amount of time you're able to eat this in advance, the more calories you can eat. You want to give your body enough time to digest it. And so if you're cutting it close, then this meal should be smaller. You want to avoid too much fat and fiber, because fat and fiber take a longer period of time to digest. And with this meal, you should hydrate and get in some electrolytes as well. Some food ideas based on kind of that description. Once again, the meal should be high carb, moderate protein, low fat. Could be a bagel with a little bit of nut butter and a banana, granola with some yogurt and fruit, a small breakfast burrito. You could use eggs, or if you're plant-based, maybe tofu with some potatoes and salsa, quick oats with nut butter, maple syrup and fruit, pancakes, with nut butter, fruit and maple syrup, same kind of idea. So the basis is carbohydrates. You might be getting a little bit of fat and protein, and then with more carbohydrates on top. So sometimes, I think everybody's different. Some people want to get up 2 to 3 hours before they start. Some people do not. And I think if you don't, and you can sleep, usually I'm not a very good sleeper, but if you can and you want to stay asleep, that's fine. But if you can get something in your belly about an hour before, I think it'll really make a big difference. And if you're eating an hour before you're starting your run, then the goal of this meal is really to top off your blood glucose. So you don't have enough time for this meal to actually affect glycogen stores. It's just going to elevate your blood glucose prior to start. And for that reason, this really needs to be simple carbohydrates. It should be about 25 to 30 grams of simple carbs, which is about 100 to 120 calories, water and electrolytes as well. If you haven't had protein in the last 2 to 3 hours, branched chain amino acids can be something you consider to help minimize muscle protein breakdown during your run. But really the focus should be getting in carbs and then hydrating so that you're not starting in a deficit, right? The average person burns about 600 calories while you're running. And then if you remember, that kind of limit is about 400 calories. And so we're building a 200 calorie deficit hour after hour after hour. So you don't want to start in a deficit. You want to start fueled, which is why getting something in your belly beforehand, even if you can't get that 2 to 3 hour meal in advance, getting something an hour before is great. Okay, some food ideas for this hour before meal. Small snack, once again, 100 to 120 calories. I love graham crackers. I'll grab a couple, before I run in the morning. They do really well in my stomach. Fig Newtons are good, like fresh fruit, like a banana, toast and some jam, energy gel or food puree, dried fruits, or even an energy drink is good as well. So just find what works for you, what sits in your belly well. Okay, I wanted to quickly talk about carb loading. So carb loading, I always like to say, is more than your pre-race pasta party. You carb load naturally if you're going into a taper before a large event, because you might keep your carbohydrates the same, but you're reducing the amount that you're running. But a habitual intake of about 7 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilo per day is going to get you in a good place as far as carbohydrate and glycogen levels. The quick and dirty is if you're 36 to 48 hours in advance, if you're able to take in 10 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilo per day, that will get you in a great place. So some things to pay attention to, but it's definitely more than one meal. And I like to always remind people, much like you wouldn't try new shoes or you wouldn't try, new socks or a new running vest on race day, you also shouldn't have meals that are kind of outside your normal eating habits. So make sure you're carb loading with things that are naturally in your diet and that your body's going to tolerate well. Okay, so now let's talk about during run nutrition. What do I eat while I'm running? I'm going to talk a little bit about hydration guidelines and also nutritional strategies for longer runs. So how much fluid do you need to replace? The amount that you hydrate is really dictated by the amount you sweat. And I'm going to walk you through how to do a sweat test. If you don't already know how to do them, they're super simple to do, and they can give you a lot of great information about water intake. So factors that affect the amount that you sweat include effort level, temperature, humidity, clothing type, and fluid status. I always recommend people do sweat tests kind of throughout their training, because obviously as you get more fit, the amount of effort you might be putting out on a particular run changes, seasonality can change, and that can affect how much you sweat. So do it more than once and see what changes over the course of a training block. But you essentially weigh yourself before you're running. You need to be naked at that point. Make sure you put your clothes back on before you go out for a run. Run for about an hour. And then note how many ounces of fluid, if any, you drink during that hour. Then you're going to go back home, take your clothes off, weigh yourself again, and you subtract that post-run weight from your pre-run weight. So 1 pound of weight loss equals 16 ounces of fluid. Then you're going to add the ounces lost in your sweat to the ounces that you consume to get the approximate amount of fluid that you should be drinking. So if we go through an example, if your pre-run weight was 130 pounds, you did drink while you ran for an hour, so you consumed 8 ounces. And then when you came back, you weighed yourself and you were 129 pounds. That means you lost 1 pound or 16 ounces of fluid. And then if we add the 8 ounces that you drank, you would want to replace about 80-90% of that number. So 24 ounces, you take 80 to 90% of that number, and that should be your water intake goal. So let's mix in electrolytes, right? With that, because if you're only consuming water and you're, losing large amounts of sodium, you're going to get yourself in a dangerous place. That's where issues like hyponatremia come out. If you've ever seen people staggering across the finish line, a lot of times that's a result of hyponatremia or really diluting your body's electrolytes. So we lose a lot of sodium primarily in our sweat. It averages about 500 milligrams of sodium per pound of sweat, but there's a huge range. So from 220 to 1100 milligrams per pound. And factors like genetics, diet, if you eat a lot of salt, you're going to lose a lot of sodium in your sweat, temperature, humidity, and how acclimatized you are to your running environment. These are all things that are going to affect that number. So I generally recommend that people start with about 300 to 500 milligrams of sodium per hour. And this can be obtained both through fluids if you're using a hydration product or a fueling product that has a good amount of sodium in it, but then also through foods if you're taking in salty foods as you're fueling yourself. So let's jump into nutrition. So we already covered this a little bit, but on runs of 60 to 90 minutes or less, light fueling might not be necessary, really person dependent, and what you're trying to get out of the workout. Like if you're going for a PR on your neighborhood loop, then yeah, it might be a good idea to have a little bit of carbohydrate doing it. It's going to keep your blood glucose high and make you feel better and might help your performance. Also, of runs of this length, really using thirst as an indicator of the amount that you need to drink is key. On runs over 90 minutes, this is where we kick into kind of having more of a nutritional strategy. So 160 to 360 calories per hour, or 40 to 90 grams of those simple carbs. The longer the run, the more important the caloric intake becomes, and also the farther towards kind of the higher end of that range you're going to be. So this really comes down to the type of training you've done and the amount of time that you're going to be out there. There are some pro runners that only take in 200 calories per hour, but that's because they're so fat adapted that they're really using fat as a primary fuel. But the newer you are at this, the more important kind of carbohydrate intake becomes to really fuel your effort. So play around with it. It's really important that you get an idea of where your baseline is, so what you're taking in on your runs now, and kind of work up from there and see how you feel. You want to aim for 80 to 90% of those sweat rate results, which we just went over. And then once again, I often recommend people start at about 300 to 500 milligrams of sodium per hour. Okay, so carbohydrate intake by training length. I already showed this, but just wanted to show it again. So for those longer runs, we're getting in kind of at the lower end, 30 to 60 grams per hour. And then as the length increases up to 90 grams per hour. And once again, you've got to train yourself to be able to take in this much. It might not be, if you're only taking in 90 grams per hour for an hour or two, might not be an issue. But as time goes on and you're running races that are 6, 8, 12, even longer, this is where that much carbohydrate intake, if you haven't trained your gut, could catch up to you. Okay, so some fueling ideas for longer races. Once again, these should be simple carbs, foods that are really easy to digest. I love boiled or roasted potatoes, rolled in a little bit of olive oil with some kosher salt on them. Starch, which is high in potatoes and rice, your body absorbs really quickly, and so they tend to be pretty easy on the stomach. And I often feel like, there's so much sweet stuff out there that having something that's a little bit salty and savory is a good balance to that. Fig Newtons are also a favorite. Pancakes and banana bread are good. Sports nutrition products, everything from gels, chews, and cookies, there are lots of options out there now. Energy drink is a good way to get hydration and calories in together and just kind of set a caloric baseline that then you try to, increase through adding real food in. And then dried fruit, things like dates are also a really, really good way to get in easy to digest carbs. Okay, let's talk about post-run nutrition. So post-run nutrition is always important for recovery, but it becomes particularly important for this crew that's looking potentially doing multi-day efforts or training for longer goals. When you're doing 2 workouts a day, really making sure you're getting the nutrition in to recover from what you just did is key. So in order of priority, I usually say hydration and electrolytes, really important to replace those. Carbohydrates, it's key. And then giving your body the protein it needs to repair and rebuild muscle is also important. So carb intake, if you have the time and are able to, if you can get in 1.2 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body mass per hour for the 4 to 6 hours post-training, that is ideal. If not, or if you're, only able to, because of where you are getting, one meal, trying to get in something that has a ratio of 4 parts carbohydrate to 1 part protein as soon as possible is great. People are always curious about well, do I have to get it in within an hour? You don't, but what research shows is that if you get in that carbohydrate within an hour, the level of glycogen replenishment that's seen is much higher than if you go outside that hour. So get it in as soon as you can. Getting some protein in there is really going to help with that muscle repair and recovery. And research is even shown that having the carbohydrate and protein together actually helps also with glycogen replenishment. So the two really work together. So put 30 minutes to 2 hours, I put that window in there. The goal is to replenish glycogen stores, kickstart muscle repair and synthesis, and to hydrate. You're going to be looking at 16 to 18 ounces of fluid and electrolytes. That carb intake, once again, 1.2 grams of carb per kilo of body weight per hour. That's every hour for 4 to 6 hours. So just keep eating. And then that 1 to 4 ratio of protein to simple carbs within the hour if possible. So that would look at, like, we want to get about 15 to 20 grams of protein. That's a key amount to really get the essential aminos that we need and the branched chain amino acids that we need to kickstart muscle protein synthesis and give our body the building blocks to repair that protein. And then that 4 parts carbs at that level would equate to about 45 to 80 grams of carbohydrate. So oftentimes we're running in the middle of nowhere. So this is where planning ahead and protein powder supplements or having some kind of a good carbohydrate source in your car is going to be really helpful. Okay, so some food ideas for post-run nutrition. Your meal focus should be carbohydrates, 45 to 80 grams, protein, 15 to 20 grams, and hydration. Protein shake with fruit, obviously, super easy. Granola with yogurt and fruit. Eggs and potatoes is a favorite of mine. Rice with veggies and protein, could be meat or tofu if you're plant-based. Soy is a really great source of plant-based tofu, high in essential amino acids and branched chain amino acids. Could be something as simple as a turkey sandwich. So just try to get some food in you. Sometimes we don't feel like eating, but it's really going to make you feel better in the long run. And that is everything that I have. At Gnarly, we make everyday products. We have pre-workout products. We have performance or during race products, and we have recovery products. And come visit us at gonarly.com. And if you guys have any questions for me, you can ask now. You can also email me at Shannon at gonarly.com. And I'm always happy to answer any questions you may have. But that was everything that I have for today. Hopefully I didn't run through it too fast.
Well, the good news is we've recorded this and we can watch it and re-watch it, and it's available. So while it was a lot of information, I super appreciate how, information and quality information dense it was. So
cool. Good.
Thank you. Yeah.
So
go ahead.
Yeah, if people have questions for me, I'm happy to take them now. We can turn the tables over to Andrew too. I always like if people put questions in the Q&A as opposed to the chat, because they can get lost in the chat as conversations go on. So yeah. Yeah,
I was going to say, let's definitely put the questions in the chat. I'm curious just for you, Andrew, just, from, your lenses, the training in the background, kind of the template that folks have. How do you see this information blending with the work you're asking people to do?
This was so brilliant. I mean, really, this was the information presented. I mean, I was taking notes, and I've been in endurance sport for a really long time. And it's like, maybe the numbers are the same and because they're evidence-based, but it's like, I just, the amount of content that was just delivered, it's like you said, it's fantastic. It was recorded because I think it's from mitochondria and like metabolic pathways and efficiency to where the rubber hits the road in a very simplistic way. I think what was just delivered, people should watch it again, and they should write down what was just said, because I think every individual athlete is very, very different. And so, for folks following the plan right now, and we're kind of midway through this base phase training where a lot of the work we're doing is at a relatively low output, this is a great time to implement 100% of what was just said. I think the biggest takeaway was training the gut, and I think everybody has a nutrition story that went wrong. And I speak, as an athlete myself, and then guiding athletes who are racing, if it never anything new on race day. And so one thing I would offer and just reiterate that was already said was nothing new on race day. I mean, and so when it comes to nutrition, the longer you go, the more it matters. So implementing these strategies in your training, you can't put a price tag on it. I think it's crucial. So, yeah.
I've got a question for you, and then I definitely want to kind of respond to questions that are coming up in the Q&A. So I'm curious because is one of the things that we've emphasized in the training period is a real emphasis on kind of like staying at a relatively lower output in the base building phase, right? So to keep things at a zone 1, zone 2, so we're getting the muscle adaptations that are building. We're kind of loosely referring to our tank, our endurance tank, and so I'm a little bit curious, Shannon, how you would sort of like, there's been a really strong emphasis on the carbs, and looking at one of those original graphs, a lot of those carbs become increasingly important as we're exercising at a higher, a higher zone or higher intensity rate. So I'm curious, just as we kind of navigate, long and slow endurance, sort of zone 1, zone 2 fueling, and how that, do you see a shift in that carb to fat intake, and how that is that my question clear in terms of like that zones of output that we're aiming at?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say carb and fat intake. I would say in zone 1 and zone 2, you're going to be burning fat that you have on board already. So those fat stores that I showed in that graph. And while it's important to take in carbs and practice your carbs during those runs, like Andrew said, you might not need as many carbs because you're at such a low output that your body can use fat aerobically. And so during that base level of training, it might not be as important. Often for a long, slow distance, I'll have the same run that I always do. And I do it because what you're building during that type of training is you're building cardiovascular efficiency. And so that your same perceived effort or your same cardiac output will take you further the more cardiovascularly efficient you get. And that's the idea behind that training, because essentially you're getting faster at a lower effort level. And that lower effort level allows you to still burn fat, but at a faster pace now, because you've built your cardiovascular efficiency. And that's why it's so important to do early in the season. And then you do all of your accessory speed work and strength work to kind of fine tune that engine later on. So it's monotonous and often people hate it, but it's really what you should do kind of to build the base of your training that you can then capitalize later on in the season.
And would you say the fueling strategies, how are they different during those base runs, in terms of what you've kind of shared? Is there a different fueling strategy during that base building period? Or
yeah, I think as long as you're being strict about being in zone 1 and zone 2, I feel like a lot of early new athletes might not be as strict about training in that zones and are just going out there. As long as you really are in zone 1 and zone 2, you might not need as much carbohydrate. I would always say carry more, because you never want to not have enough, but you might be more towards that like 60 grams per hour, even though you're on a 3 or 4 hour run. People like Kilian Jornet, fuel with like 150 to 200 calories an hour on longer runs. And it's because his system is so tuned to burning fat. Like, he's been running at that level for such a long time, and he's built up a lot of cardiovascular efficiency. And, not everyone can do that, and it takes a lot of time to really get to that point. And so I would say, like, it's hard for me to make a generalization, because I think, as Andrew said, everybody's different. They're starting at a different point. But typically, if you're in zone 1 and zone 2, you might not need to take in as many calories than if you were kind of in a zone 3, 4 run of the same length or duration. Then, because you're at that higher intensity, that's when making sure you're getting in enough calories is key.
Great, thanks. Go ahead, Andrew.
Well, just somebody asked a question that I wrote down as well, so I thought it might be worth maybe chatting about. Was it's like, when I get this much information, and this is just my personality type, I get super stoked. I start writing it down. I'm like, I'm going to implement this tomorrow. One of the things that we talked about was how to track our just to get a sense of our patterns of like what we're consuming, which I think in the broader context of the conversation we're having, like carbohydrate availability and our nutritional patterns. Do you have a recommended app or way that people might track? There was earlier in the presentation, there was a really good formula for sweat to establish those numbers. But as far as like bringing it down to like a pretty specific science of our intake, how would you recommend folks do that? And I hope I didn't butcher the question in the Q&A, but it's kind of a question that I had. Well,
I mean, MyFitnessPal is free. It's pretty easy to use. You can enter in your own recipes, or you can search by general food, like brand or type. Like you can search red potatoes and it'll pull up like boiled, roasted, all these different ways to cook it with olive oil alone. Or you can search like Trader Joe's chicken salad or whatever, and chances are somebody has put Trader Joe's chicken salad, the macros in there. I think it's a good way to start. There are definitely some fancier kind of pay versions of that, of apps that you can use to track macros. I am used to looking at things enough that I don't really like use an app per se. I just, have an idea of how many carbs I'm getting in. I know typical serving sizes. I typically, for most people, I don't recommend like tracking like crazy, because I feel like sometimes that can build a bad relationship with food. But I feel like it can be useful to do it to get a good idea of your baseline. Maybe do it for a week, keep a food journal to get an idea of where you are, because I think it can surprise a lot of people. And then after doing that exercise for, 7 to 10 days, you start to get an idea of like, oh, I always have this meal and it's this many carbs. But yeah, MyFitnessPal is a good free way to do it. And I know that there are some good pay apps as well. I'm just not super familiar with them.
Sweet. Yeah. And the only thing to ask that question, the other thing that's out there is, if you're more visual, you can do palm based, like size of your hand based.
Yeah. So like a fist is carbohydrate, like palm is protein, like thumb is your fat. Yeah, it's great.
Track those down, but sweet. Thank you.
Cool. I'm looking at some of the Q&A questions here too. This would be a fairly easy one. Looking at the sweat calculation, like, what if you go to the bathroom during the run? Does that, does that run out unless you're out there collecting your
that kind of messes it up a little bit.
It's like, wait a sec. So we sort of discard that data set from that run.
Yeah, try to empty your bladder ahead of time.
Which I'm just going to put it out there. I think that's such a great strategy to kind of train the body for that morning bowel movement and, and urination, because man,
early coffee
in the morning. Oh,
yeah, so, I'm all about it.
Like nothing new on race day.
Yeah.
We talked about that. So just a question here about just as people age, and this is something we see in kind of in our demographic, we see a lot of runners in their, 50s, 60s. Is there any recommendations or thoughts as athletes age, a 20-year-old versus a 60-year-old, how that caloric intake is are there general guidelines, or at that point are we just like person age specific?
So my recommendations for older athletes are, it's funny, they're not so endurance based. Focus on protein intake and start lifting weights. Those are my recommendations. The major issues with aging athletes, tends to be the difficulty with maintaining, let alone putting on muscle. And then on top of that, are the threshold for the amount of protein that we need in our diets to turn on muscle protein synthesis pushes back. So whereas like a 20-something-year-old can consume 20 to 30 grams of protein and it stimulates muscle protein synthesis and we put on muscle, for people in my in our 40s, like me, or even older, that pushes all the way out to 40 grams of protein. So getting in on enough protein and then doing weight bearing exercise, or exercise that promotes building muscle, is really going to help with longevity in terms of preventing injury and just having the muscles to keep moving and keep active. And that's the key to like really kicking ass as you get older. So I would say if you're not already, start a strength routine and then prioritize protein in your diet.
Cool. Great. Another question here. So how do you fuel better for endurance sports if you are pre-diabetic? So are there adjustments made to the amount of carbs?
I am not a registered dietitian, so I would push that off to somebody who's trained to speak to people with diabetes. I would say that exercise in and of itself, it has control. It increases your insulin sensitivity. So being active, some people control their diabetes through exercise, but where carbohydrates kind of supersede that, I don't feel like I'm qualified to answer that question. So I would direct you to your medical professional.
Yeah, appreciate that.
Yeah.
We've got a question from Bree, who comes and guides for us, and she's running Cocodona 250. And she's curious, like, which is, that's a big race. So
yeah,
how does that, how do you, what are the training strategies for that kind of a distance, 250 miles?
For fueling, or I'll pass off to Andrew for the training.
Fueling, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the fueling, to do something of that length, your effort levels, or the zones that you're going to be running in, are going to be lower. And so the ability to take in more calories and more complex foods in terms of like maybe a little more fat, maybe some more protein, something that you have time to digest, is going to be a little different than even if you're doing a 100-mile race, right? So definitely doing some gut training, doing longer runs where you're taking in foods that you would see and plan to take in on the course. But often, we work a lot with Mike McKnight, who always does that race, and Ben Light, who's another athlete that have done those races. And, they end up having, like, I know Mike regularly has smoothies. So really fruit packed, even though he's a fat adapted keto athlete, during races that are that length, like he'll have a smoothie during his run. So it's a lot of simple carbs, but he's trained his gut to be able to take in that much at once. So I think the concept is the same. Maybe you're bringing in more protein and more fats, but as Andrew kind of reiterated, like making sure you're practicing anything that you're doing during your training that you're planning to do during the race. So if you're not having hamburgers during your training runs, then I wouldn't recommend having one during Cocodona. But I'll be chatting.
Tacos for Cocodona.
Yeah, I know. I'll be talking a little bit about nutrition for Cocodona as well. So Fuel 2.0 will be on that race course also.
Cool. Well, we're coming up on our hour, Shannon, and I really want to thank you for your time. It's been super valuable to connect with you. Just so folks are tuning in, we do have a discount specifically for Gnarly Nutrition products, which is Aspire 15. We'll send that out in an email. And then one of the folks tuning in tonight is also going to be eligible. We're going to be doing a raffle for some free Gnarly Nutrition products. So look for the follow-up email that'll come out probably midweek, that I'll have the recording, and it'll have that discount code and someone who's going to walk with some Gnarly Nutrition products. Thank you. I want to cut Shannon loose so she can be with her family. And then I want to kind of transition to kind of a check-in with Andrew, specifically kind of where we're at in the training program, and then open it up for questions specifically for Andrew that people have as they're going through the training process. So
awesome. Thanks, guys.
Great.
Thanks for having me on. It's
for sure.
a pleasure.
Cool. Take care.
Yeah.
I guess one of the things I'll just kind of say is we kind of